He foresaw that communism and capitalism, once again I'm using the old vocabulary, would ultimately merge back into one system. And that is where we are today. That is where we are today. I'm greatly looking forward to being the new director of FVD International. The goal is twofold, Thierry has just said. The first goal is to organize events like this, where we will consolidate and increase FVD's reputation as the most interesting, cutting-edge, thoughtful party in Europe, probably the world. And international, also, of course, in the sense that you've just said, Thierry, bringing FVD's ideas and activities out into the open. As you know, Thierry and his fantastic team in the Tweede Kamer bring issues onto the table which are not discussed in any other country. And the big goal, therefore, is to bring these things out into the world, into English above all, so that people understand the importance of FVD. It's a delight to see you all, and it's deeply impressive to see how so many of you here. Thank you for coming. I'd like to open the evening on China by giving a bit of context, a bit of historical, and if you don't mind, philosophical context to the situation that we're in. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, knows George Orwell. Everybody knows how Orwell, with phenomenal lucidity and foresight, predicted the totalitarian world in which we live now. He predicted a world in which our own television screens would listen to us, these things, would listen to us, know where we are, and be able to follow us and, in some cases, even control us. He predicted that in 1948. It's an extraordinary achievement, and that's why we all continue to read him today. But there's another prediction that George Orwell made, which most people miss, many people miss. And it comes at the end of Animal Farm. The prediction about the television screens is in 1984. I'm not sure if you remember, but the last lines of Animal Farm are prophetic. Animal Farm is an allegory of the Bolshevik Revolution. It tells the story of how the animals in a farm throw off the reign of the farmers, expel the farmers, and establish their own regime. And quickly, of course, the regime becomes dictatorial. It's taken over by the pigs, and the pigs symbolize in the book the new communist elite, which is even more dictatorial than the old farmers' regime. But the last line of Animal Farm is almost, I would say, even more prophetic than the elements that we know in 1984. Do you remember what it was? At the end of Animal Farm, the farmers come back. The pigs invite the farmers back. There's a reconciliation between communism, embodied by the pigs, and capitalism, embodied by the farmers. The farmers come back into the farmhouse, and the poor working animals, symbolizing, of course, ordinary people, are left outside in the cold. And they start to play cards and they fight and so on, but ultimately they are together. The communists and the capitalists, if I use the old Cold War vocabulary, come back together. And the last line of Animal Farm is, the animals outside looked in, and their eyes moved from man to pig, and from pig to man, and from man to pig back again, and already it was impossible to tell which was which. In other words, he foresaw that communism and capitalism, once again I'm using the old vocabulary, would ultimately merge back into one system. And that is where we are today. That is where we are today. And this merging of communism and capitalism, again, I hesitate to use these words, but they are the words of the Cold War, didn't happen by chance. It wasn't a tactical decision by the two sides, the two former enemies, to make up and to make bygones be bygones and to declare peace. No. The convergence has a far deeper and far more important cause. And the cause is this. It is that, as I'm sure many of you in this room know, Marxism was never discredited in Western Europe. Marxism, throughout the whole of the Cold War, flourished in Western Europe. It wasn't, of course, in power, but it flourished in the universities, in schools, in the media, for generations. And whereas, of course, in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, Marxism was totally discredited, instead, at the end of the Cold War, it transmogrified itself in the West and adopted an apparently new philosophy. Now, China has played a very specific role in this coming together of capitalism and communism. The non-discrediting of Marxism was symbolized, I think, in an absolutely overwhelming way in 2018, when the previous president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, spoke at a ceremony to erect a statue, a big bronze statue of Karl Marx, which had been donated by China and now stands in the town square of Trier in Germany, Karl Marx's birthplace. The president of the European Commission was the principal speaker at this moment when China brought Marx. We are putting up statues to Marx in Western Europe while they have been torn down in Eastern Europe for a generation. And as I say, China, who donated this statue of Marx, has played a very key role in this. Because when I said just now that Marxism remained dominant in cultural and intellectual circles in Western Europe, there are, of course, different currents of Marxism. There were some Marxist intellectuals and public figures who were favorable to the Soviet Union. But there was also a large section of the left which was not favorable to the Soviet Union for various reasons. In particular, Trotskyites and Maoists. And while many of you, and it's certainly my case, might associate Mao with the most terrible of all communist atrocities, even in comparison to Stalin, the fact is that Maoism was highly influential. And people who were Marxist but not pro-Soviet were heavily supported in the West as part of the Cultural Cold War. There's a fabulous book on the Cultural Cold War by an English historian called Frances Stoner Saunders, and she explains how the Western security services, in their war of ideas, specifically targeted left-wingers whom they wanted, of course, not to be pro-Russian, not to be pro-Soviet. There was no point targeting the right-wingers because the right-wingers were anti-communist anyway. So these people were given an extra push. They were given funding and so on. I'll just give you two examples of the kind of people I'm talking about. You've definitely heard of the first one, José Manuel Barroso, who was the president of the European Commission before Juncker. In 1974, in the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, Juncker was the leader of the reorganized Party of the Proletariat, which is the Maoist Communist Party of Portugal. He then went on, his career is very symbolic. He went on to be a mega globalist by being the president of the European Commission. And guess what he does now? He's a director of Goldman Sachs. Another figure, perhaps less well known in the Netherlands, but extremely well known in France, where I live, is Bernard-Henri Lévy, who is the foreign minister of France and has been the foreign minister of France for about 30 years. He did the Bosnian War, he did the Libyan War, he wanted the Syrian War, he wants war against Russia and so on. He's a former Maoist. So China, during the Cold War, played an important role in preparing this convergence. All right? Now, I mentioned a change that happened in Marxism. This change took place at the time of the end of the Cold War. What happened was that certain Marxists, a certain section of the left, particularly the anti-Soviet left, realized or came to the conclusion that the Soviet Union was a reactionary power. They were, of course, revolutionaries, they were progressives. The Soviet Union was a reactionary power. Why? Because the Soviet Union refused globalization. It refused the world financial market. It refused trade. It had, we all know, a planned economy. That was one of the main reasons why this section of the left hated the Soviet Union. Because those people wanted Marxist internationalism through globalization. And they got out their copies of the Communist Manifesto and they reread it. And what did they find there? They find Marx and Engels explaining that the most powerful revolutionary force in the world is capitalism. It's capitalism which tears down nations. It's capitalism which tears down families. You can read the passages for yourself. The bourgeoisie has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and so on. There are long, long passages in the Communist Manifesto explaining this. And they read this and they thought, my God, he's right. If we're going to have one world, if we're going to have internationalism, never forget Marx and Engels said the worker has no country. The worker has no country. If we're going to have that, we have to have globalization. Well, again, I don't need to tell you, China has played an absolutely fundamental role in being an actor in the last 30 years of globalization. And we saw the importance, the absolutely crucial importance of China in this respect shortly after the election of Donald Trump. Trump had been in the White House for about 3 weeks when Xi Jinping was invited to Davos, your favorite international forum. Why was Xi Jinping invited to Davos? He was invited to Davos in order for the globalists to say, we are not going to have Trumpian America First protectionism. And he was, of course, welcomed at Davos. He was welcomed in such a servile way that even some of the Davos men and women present, were embarrassed because Schwab was so servile towards him. Schwab said, the international community is looking to China to continue its responsive and responsible leadership, if you please, in providing all of us with confidence and stability. So China was the globalists' guard dog, if you like, against the man causing trouble in the United States of America. And if you haven't, I mentioned it in July, but if you haven't yet read Thierry's book on the Het Corona Bedrog, please read it. That's some of the most interesting passages in that book. Explain how Chinese influence was then absolutely decisive in locking us all down. The lockdowns and all the other repressive measures came from China. I'm not going to repeat it now. You can look it up in the book. In other words, what we had in Davos was the convergence that I talked about when I began mentioning Animal Farm. It embodies exactly that convergence, the pigs and the men, and you can't tell one from the other. Davos, by the way, we refer to the World Economic Forum as Davos, because that's where it meets, as we know, in January every year. But what few people know is that actually there are 2 World Economic Forum summits every year, and one of them is in China. So it is deeply involved, the World Economic Forum, with China. And this then, as I say, shows how China has played ideologically and practically an absolutely fundamental role in consolidating, in creating and consolidating globalization in a way which is perfectly compatible with the Marxism, which of course continues to be the official ideology of China. Now, if we're holding this symposium today, it's because this convergence seems to be coming under stress. In June, NATO declared, I won't say declared war on China, but declared China to be a strategic enemy and a danger to the international world system. We all know about the Pelosi visit to Taiwan. The American political class, we'll hear in a moment from our American speakers, has been to some extent divided on the issue of China. This is because, I mentioned this again in July, NATO declared China to be an enemy. The Chinese reacted absolutely furiously. They issued a declaration saying that NATO had shed blood and committed crimes and was waging proxy wars and so on. China, by contrast, had peace. So the convergence seems to be coming under strain. That's what I would like our American speakers, who I'll introduce in a minute, I'm sure will talk to us about that. I want to just conclude before passing the floor to our keynote speaker with this very impressive quotation by Henry Kissinger, who is, of course, always very lucid and who was, as you all know, the architect of Richard Nixon's famous visit to China in 1972, a visit which we should understand as classic geopolitics. That's not so much the convergence of West and East, it's geopolitics. They wanted to weaken Russia, so they tried to court China in its place as a counterbalance and partly succeeded. Now, by contrast, and this will be the subject of our discussion, NATO and the West seems to want to fight Russia and China at the same time, as if that were possible. And Henry Kissinger said this: "We are at the edge of war with Russia and China on issues which we partly created, without any concept of how this is going to end or what it is supposed to lead to." It's a brilliant remark.